I want, first of all, to express my sincere appreciation to the principal, Andrew McRae, who has been an increasingly close friend and now is a very hospitable host, the entire faculty and leaders of Acadia Divinity College and Acadia University. This has been a high point in my short life and career, and it has been over 2 years in the making, and it has fulfilled a lot of dreams. I have learned a great deal this week, and I have enjoyed immensely the talkback sessions and the small conversations that we've had in walking to and from and over coffee and other refreshments along the way. I've also appreciated very deeply the wonderful hospitality and the very good food, which I am bearing up under as well as my belt will allow. Thank you very, very much for the warmth of your hospitality. The second thing to say is that it's working. There are all kinds of voluntary expressions under my door and at my lunch table, and even tonight as I come to you for the last time. Someone shares from the October the 8th, 1990 Christianity Today, a cartoon where a rather harried layperson comes into a clerical collared clergyman and says in his office, "Hello, I'm here to involve my gifts in a ministry of sensitivity and sacrifice to challenge a secularized, value-impoverished society with the radical claims of the gospel. I have Thursday afternoons free, 3 to 5 p.m. Thank you for sharing that. That long title tonight is a way, really, of getting after something that every one of us face, the attraction to or the challenge of in local church and the religious culture life that we share in the late 20th century. Those organizations which we now call parachurch and which enrich and have enriched over the last 200 years or so, maybe longer if you're counting even farther back in the history of Protestant and Catholic thought, what we mean by Christian endeavor. I'd like to begin with what I think is a curious piece of biblical tradition that seems to say a lot about those pieces of creation that are often unseen but very important and lie outside of immediate consciousness. The writer of the book of Proverbs wrote, "The ants are not a strong folk, but they prepare their food in the summer. The badgers are not mighty folk, yet they make their houses in the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet all of them go out in ranks. The lizard you may grasp with your hands, yet it is in the king's palace." My commentary, so it is with the parachurch. As we have seen in Lectures 2 and 3, Protestant voluntary associations, as well as denominational groups, were formed in response to the prevailing conditions within the church and culture. Tonight, I want us to take a look at how voluntarism provides a vehicle for change now and in some case studies over the last century or so. Change in the form of experimentation, diversification, and renewal. They're often the byproducts of voluntarism which have radically altered the course of our religious life. Ironically, many organizations which originally owed their identity to voluntarism find themselves, after institutionalization, in a permanent social context, characterized by protectionism and at counterpoint with the freshest waves of the voluntary spirit. Given the general cultural voluntarism which has transpired over the last 200 years in transatlantic societies, this pattern or circle of voluntarism to institutionalization, to the rebirth of voluntarism, and so it goes, is an important feature of religious life in Western culture. In order to observe the cycle and analyze its overall impact, let's examine closely 4 emphases of voluntarism in the past 2 centuries: renewal, critique, ecumenism, and service. In each category, voluntary associations led directly to institutional modifications and/or social change, which is exemplified in specific cases. First of all, let's look at renewal. An outstanding example among the free churches of renewal occurred in the establishment of the Baptist Missionary Society at Kettering, England in 1792. Formed by just 13 men of legend who gave a little over 13 pounds sterling to the cause of evangelizing the heathen, the particular Baptist Missionary Society for propagating the gospel among the heathen became a catalyst for renewal not only of Baptists in England, but of Christians on both sides of the Atlantic and far beyond the Baptist family. The origins of the society lie in waves of theological revision, economic advancement, and earlier patterns, as we've seen, of dissenter voluntarism. For decades before the society was founded, Baptists of the Calvinistic type in England and Scotland and Wales had lamented the impoverished state of religion in their churches, particularly in the English churches. Stifling was the system of hyper-Calvinism articulated by the master, John Gill of Carter Lane Church. He wrote a very famous systematic theology that a friend, less of a friend after he made this comment, called A Virtual Sea of Mud. Writer-pastors like Robert Hall of Arnsby and Andrew Fuller of Kettering began to break the grip of determinism by suggesting, quote Fuller, "The way to Jesus is open to everyone who chooses, and it is the duty of men to trust Christ for their salvation." Elsewhere, a quiet movement instigated over several years by the Reverend John Sutcliffe of Olney called for frequent prayer meetings for renewal. These internal forces, plus the newly published geographical and anthropological knowledge about the uncivilized portions of the world, and there was a lot of this literature that came out in the press after 1750, captured the attention of all people of a cobbler preacher that we've met before, William Carey. Carey, Fuller, and others among the founders of the BMS were well aware of predecessor mission bodies. Carey recalled in his pamphlet, A Solemn Enquiry, published in 1792, that the New England Company of a century before had pioneered missions to the Indians, and that Baptists had been involved in that project. Further, he acknowledged Moravian and Catholic missions. The latter he referred to as vicious papists. His first biographer was convinced that he relied on the plan and the name for the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. We affectionately remember that as the SPG. But significantly, he focused on the heathen in contrast to Anglican expansionism. For the principles of organization, the BMS committee drew upon models like the Baptist Board, the Particular Baptist Education Society, and especially the Bristol Baptist Education Society. Bristol college men, including John Ryland, John Sutcliffe, Samuel Pierce, William Stoughton, and Thomas Blundell were all active in the initial stages of BMS and well understood how to organize according to Baptist polity. While much has been made, though, of the pastor-theologian personalities in the origins of the BMS, let me challenge your thinking tonight by suggesting that I think it was shoemaker Thomas Gotch who must have made a significant impact on the thinking of those other 12 people. Gotch was an entrepreneur in Kettering, whose house provided the setting for the initial meetings of the BMS. He had created a thriving shoe manufacturing business, plus a leading banking house in the village, and was well known for his administrative genius. It was Gotch who persuaded Carey to lay aside his cobbler work in Gotch's business in order to study Greek and Hebrew full-time. That's real recruitment, by the way. And it was Gotch who supported not only the mission cause, but other Baptist voluntary work as well. I believe it was a combination of theological revision, dogged voluntary spirit, generous business ability that led to the formation of a society which Kenneth Scott Latourette called, in hyperbole, a new era of missions in the entire world. Now, what I'm really interested in at this point is, what was the impact of the BMS on other places and other circumstances? The impact upon particular Baptist life in England was immediate. In order to raise funds for the Carey mission plan for India, Fuller, Samuel Pierce, and John Ryland traveled widely to establish a base of support for the society. As the interest in global evangelization spread, church leaders began to call for evangelism and renewal of churches at home. John Fawcett exemplifies how it took place in Yorkshire. At Hebden Bridge Church, a small congregation in the mining region, he advocated the establishment of an academy at Horton, which would train leaders in the Northampton traditions. The first principal of that school, William Stedman, was the genius of a new system of education in the North, whereby student pastors were sent out into the associations to start new churches. Stedman was the driving force behind the Itinerant Society, later the Home Mission Movement, founded in 1809. Historians have traced the revival among the particular Baptist churches to virtually every part of England and Wales as a direct result of something called Fullerism and the creation of the Baptist Missionary Society. It also had a close parallel in the Scottish revivals, which engaged those congregations in renewal movements as well. The success and impact of the BMS urged Baptists in Great Britain to form a new spate of similar voluntary organizations to advance the cause of Christ. William Fox, a Baptist pastor, helped to found in 1785 what would become, after the BMS experience, the Society for the Establishment of Sunday Schools. Joseph Hughes led in the formation of the British and Foreign Bible Society, an outgrowth of the Religious Tract Society in 1799. Similar Bible-related projects were founded in Edinburgh. Older educational schemes were revived, such as the Baptist academies at Stepney and Bristol, which saw a rise dramatically in enrollment in the early 19th century. A leading voluntarist in the area was undoubtedly the Reverend Joseph Ivamy, who was active in the formation of the Baptist Itinerant Society and the Baptist Irish Society, a scheme of English Baptists to try and convert their Irish brothers and sisters. Spurred on by his work with the BMS, Ivamy proposed in 1811 the establishment of a union of all Baptists, essentially for voluntary service, which was the root of the denomination's development as such, certainly in England, if not on a broader scale. Hundreds of pounds sterling were collected by Ivamy for overseas missions through the channel of the union meetings in London. As one historian put it, in the early 19th century, the Mission Society had acted like a magnet upon Baptist churches, drawing them together as never before in a common purpose and putting new life into them. The impact of the BMS voluntarism was felt in the United States as well. Carey's letters from Serampore provided grist for the first American religious periodicals and prompted the formation of missionary societies at local levels up and down the East Coast in the 1790s. The New York Missionary Society, composed of Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Baptists, responded to the example of Carey by beginning a mission to the Western Indians. In 1810, a major endeavor was launched in the formation of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which produced as its first missionaries Adoniram and Ann Judson, who read extensively about Carey's accomplishments and, by the way, determined that he would not convert them to Baptist principles, And by the time they'd gotten to India, they were requesting baptism. So powerful was the force unleashed. Perhaps the best example of American voluntary experience in response to the Baptist Missionary Society was the Triennial Convention. Between meetings of this body, the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society carried forth its programs in India, Burma, China, and among Indian peoples. It was essentially a collection of individuals, churches, and associations brought together with great enthusiasm by a common interest in sharing the gospel overseas. Less voluntary in style, though, but obviously part of the whole response were organizations of Methodists, Lutherans, and Reformed churches, a definite response to the voluntarism begun in 1792. Historians of American religion are clear in their assessment that a major byproduct of the Second Great Awakenings, which start by some people's reckonings in the first decade of the 19th century and probably come to a conclusion in the 1840s, the organizational advancement and commitment to missionary endeavor of all kinds. As churches were started and/or renewed, domestic missionary endeavor was a project of high interest, and the voluntary society model allowed for experimentation and expedition of that enterprise. Societies could take shape among interested individuals very quickly, while ecclesiastical judicatories like associations, presbyteries, synods, conferences continued to debate just like the people did in the Northampton Association when William Carey first explained his plans. But it was the voluntary society, once again, that was able to bring quick and dramatic renewal. Little wonder that our friend Alexis de Tocqueville, a French visitor to the United States and Canada in the early 1800s, observed that the whole United States was organized according to society principles. Canadians, too, eventually expressed high interest in the Baptist Missionary Society. In 1827, the Baptist Missionary Magazine of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick featured inaugural pieces on William Ward and the Carey Mission in Calcutta. In Volume 1, Number 1 of the Canada Baptist Magazine in 1837, there was a full treatment of William Carey and the Society's work. Earlier, the BMS had actually commissioned John Gilmore and John Edwards for service in the Canadas, making his 1837 trip, Gilmore that is, back to Britain to raise money for Canadian Baptist missions, a natural course of events. One of the most remarkable evidences of voluntarism in the wake of the BMS achievement would be the transformation of Baptist denominational work. At the end of the 18th century, denominations were defined by a spread of churches holding to a common confession or heritage, as, for instance, we saw last evening, the Baptist and the Mennonites, respectively. When, however, the voluntary societies emerged as part of the same constituency, here comes the parachurch, and support network, leaders were quick to propose an integration of the regular confessional bodies, associations, yearly meetings, and synods, with the more attractive and aggressive societies. The end result was that the confessional bodies came to legitimate the efforts of the societies, and the societies became accountable through reports and publications to the associations, etc. Gradually, through a series of common annual meetings called anniversaries and interlocking boards of trustees or directors, the society tradition was fused with the confessional tradition into a unified sense of denomination. In some cases, notably the Baptist and Methodist, to cite two very different examples of polity, the societies became the program agencies of the denominations. Worth noting is that fundraising and nurture of the constituency were dramatically enhanced in the names of the objects of the voluntary societies. And we still know that's true today, by the way. Much more attractive than paying for the general convention budget is a foreign mission project. In the United States and Canada, the cycle of voluntarism for renewal was made complete with the establishment in the 20th century of a new set of organizations for mission endeavor. Here are the troubled waters. Essentially unhappy with the latitudinarian policies of the denominational bodies, or with the perceived arbitrary control of appointments and expenditures, new voluntary expressions with denominational distinctives emerged to rekindle the passion for mission and evangelization. Among these in the United States would be the Association of Baptists for World Evangelism, watch the year 1927, and the Conservative Baptist Foreign Mission Society in 1943. In Canada, a similar effort was to be found in the Regular Baptist Mission Society, which was a part of the Shields organizational platform. This tendency, the logical extreme of voluntarism, just keeping alive the dynamic, ensured the renewal of ideas while creating a certain degree of insecurity for the older organizations who turn now to endowments and interdenominational cooperation as answers to lower voluntary contributions. The net result of the proliferation of voluntary mission efforts in the 20th century has often not been the renewal of denominational bodies, but their splintering. In both Canada and the United States, entirely new denominational groups have arisen around new foreign mission enterprises. The Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches and the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches, known affectionately as Garbage, are prime examples. Further, the presence of additional missionary personnel in a given field from a competitive confessional body has led to the diminution of personnel from the original organization. For example, the various Baptist bodies in India from 1925 to 1950. Efficiency and overall good stewardship are not necessarily the byproducts as voluntary renewal continues to spin off and take place. Voluntarism leads also, though, to increased cooperation. Another important contribution of the voluntarist tradition is the tendency toward greater cooperation among Christians. The appropriate term for this, to be sure, is ecumenism, though the term itself is often loaded with pejorative connotations. Ecumenical relationships and related activities have a long history in the life of the church. Generally, they are of two kinds. The majority involve arrangements of a formal nature between churches or church bodies, which are negotiated and implemented officially by representatives of the cooperating churches. But a second class is voluntary entirely. The purpose of ecumenical relationships can be multifold, including confessional revision, mission, and service. What I want to do for a few minutes is look at those which are purely voluntary. The process of creating a confession of faith which adequately describes theological self-understanding has been at times an ecumenical venture because it involves voluntary conversations between congregations or groups of churches. Such was the case, for instance, between Baptists and Mennonites in 1609 through 1626, when John Smythe and others after him attempted to reach a common understanding of doctrine and practice for possible joint recognition of memberships. Unfortunately, Smythe could not convince all of his following that the union was desirable, and there were pronounced differences on matters of the magistry, the bearing of arms, and the doctrine of Christ, to name three areas. After a decade of conversations, the Baptist-Mennonite relationship concluded voluntarily and amicably until 1989. Similar theological conversations of a confessional type ensued also among congregational representatives of General and Particular Baptist in England in the 1670s. The Particular Baptists published their Second Confession in 1677, which gave direct evidence of their kinship with the Westminster Presbyterian Confession of 1646. To portray some affinity with Calvinistic Baptists, some General Baptists likewise issued in 1678 the Orthodox Creed. Both of these statements emphasize the similarities between the groups. The formation of the Evangelical Alliance, to jump 200 years into the 19th century, in 1846 provides another example of voluntary ecumenism. The ideal of the promoters of the alliance was a union of individual Christians belonging to different churches, an experiment in Christian cooperation for the sake of combating popery, Puseyism, and Plymouth Brethrenism. Edward B. Pusey, who lived through much of the 19th century, was, after 1841, the leader of the Oxford movement, which was actually an attempt to revive high churchism among the liturgical churches. Those invited were of the voluntary system and included over 12,000 delegates to the official proceedings. The actual outgrowths of the alliance meetings were a renewal of concerted prayer for Christian unity, increased data gathering about Christian endeavor, a defense of religious liberty, and a renewed interest in world missions. While the alliance lacked a permanent paid staff, a forward program, and consistent support from churches, it did create an entirely new climate of ecumenism among Protestant Christians. Ecumenical historian Ruth Rouse has pointed out, the alliance gave great impetus to world mission. It expressed a new form of unity among very diverse Christians, and it strengthened the whole principle of voluntary associations among Christians. In direct linear progression from the Evangelical Alliance were the Student Volunteer Movement, the World's Parliament of Religions, and the International Missionary Council, which has major import for this century. The official stream, in quotes, of the ecumenical movement, that is the one that ecumenical historians like to talk about the most, which eventuated in the World Council of Churches in 1948, was originally envisioned by prophets like historian Philip Schaff to be a voluntary association of different churches in their official capacity, each retaining its freedom and independence. What actually transpired was a confederation of church representatives bound by bylaws to the programs of the Council's various divisions. Several of the historically voluntary members of the World Council of Churches have experienced genuine constituency problems and have at times considered options and even exercised them of dropping out or moving to associate membership because of the accusations of a super church, or the imposition of undesirable connectionalism, or too loose an affiliation with Episcopal churches. While the World Council has had a stormy history of constituency relationships, it has also indirectly prompted the voluntary association of other Christians for similar purposes. During the same period that the World Council was in its genesis from 1925 to 1948, numerous national and interconfessional bodies on the same model were taking shape with similar agendas. Some had started even earlier, like the Lutheran World Federation, the Baptist World Alliance, the Methodist World Congress. The Federal Council of Churches of Christ in the United States was a pioneer national association in 1913. A British council was approved by 11 denominations in 1942, and a similar body in Canada was created in 1944. These councils have often borne the structural imprint of the World Council. Other cross-confessional cooperation and fellowships were also established on different bases. Fascinating and of major importance in this latter regard were the National Association of Evangelicals, founded in the United States in 1964 by a coalition of conservative and independent evangelicals, and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, an outgrowth of a coffee talk in the U.S. movement founded by Oswald J. Smith and Harry Fought, two Pentecostal pastors from Toronto. Both of these groups reflect the need for evangelical cooperation, yet neither propose to interfere in the affairs of any denomination per se. Individual memberships and churches may contribute to these organizations, which provide annual conferences for fellowship, scholarly exchanges as the primary thrust of the voluntary principle. At the international level, the World Association of Evangelicals, founded in 1961, provides periodic fellowship for many of the national groups. As the individual denominations have sought closer cooperation among their own regional and national units, or through the conciliar vehicle, the evangelical ecumenical organizations, such as the NAE and the EFC, have provided an alternative which is very attractive for experimentation and fellowship. An important and recent example of comprehensive international voluntarism, which is set up to promote closer cooperation among religious groups, is undoubtedly the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization. Founded in 1974, Lausanne is in the embryonic stages of structural development. It's like finding the missing link. We can see it. And it gives evidence of typical voluntary attributes. At the invitation of American evangelist Billy Graham, 3,700 delegates and visitors met for over a week in Lausanne, Switzerland in summer 1974 to discover new means for world evangelization. The Congress produced a remarkable sense of unity among delegates of churches, individuals, and associations from 150 nations, 50% of whom were from two-thirds world countries. The most important products of the Congress were the Lausanne Covenant and the continuing Lausanne Committee. The Covenant is a 3,000-word, 15-point statement of evangelical principles drafted by the British clergyman John R.W. Stott. The purpose of the Lausanne Committee is, quote, to further the evangelization of the world by building bridges of understanding and cooperation among Christian leaders everywhere. It could well have been said in 1846 or 1925 in the World Council of Churches. As a continuing body of well-reputation clergy and laity from every continent, primarily Protestant, the committee promotes evangelism, studies of biblical theology, prayer strategies, statistical and cultural data, religious liberty, and stewardship for evangelism. To give a continual visibility to what the 75-member committee desires to call a movement rather than a power structure, persons of vision and experience are commissioned for specific tasks. Regional international congresses are held and special task groups are identified. 4 working groups define the tasks of Lausanne: theology, strategy, intercession, and communications. There's a studious avoidance of the terminology and verbs of the World Council of Churches. Sharply distinguished from the ecumenical movement, the Lausanne leadership stresses the maintenance of the integrity of individual associations and church bodies which cooperate with it. In order to avoid structural predominance, the committee is sustained by a small financial development office in Charlotte, North Carolina, led by Leighton Ford, formerly of the Graham Organization. An equally simple program function is supplied by a changing executive director whose offices have been in Singapore, California, and Oxford, England. The Executive Committee meets bi-yearly, and a second general international gathering called Lausanne II met at Manila in 1989. The bonding element for the Lausanne movement is, of course, the covenant. To participate in Lausanne activities, individuals, schools and churches, and other organizations are requested to sign the covenant as a basis of common theological understanding and priorities. Voluntary contributions are sought for a few common projects. such as travel subsidies for currency-restricted delegates to meetings, newsletters, report books, and, of course, salaries for the development and program offices. Voluntarism controls the ongoing programs and regional projects. Planning is done at the expense of the delegates, and the costs of meetings and services is borne by regional offerings and donations. As the Lausanne Committee moves to embrace responsibilities for the evangelical community, not unlike the World Council of Churches does for its constituency, its voluntaristic nature is undergoing transformation. Regional strategies for evangelization call for regular communications, the use of the committee as a clearinghouse of Christian information, identification of institutions and networks which will shoulder ongoing leadership and tasks. From a recent list of critical objectives, it is also apparent that Lausanne must enhance its development of financial resources, administration, and public relations, lessons learned as early as the 17th century among voluntary religious organizations. Significantly, however, the Lausanne Committee continues to identify its primary mission as cooperation and its principal human resources as volunteers rather than paid staff from its own finances. Programmatically, the Lausanne Committee is beginning to look like an international umbrella organization for those churches and people and fellowships in the evangelical theological tradition. If it is to succeed, it has been observed, it must develop its own unique style of voluntary support. What the voluntary impulse toward ecumenical relationships demonstrates most vividly from Lausanne back is the tendency of like-minded congregations or religious groups or people to seek fellowship and cooperation with each other, a premise which is basic to the voluntary principle. It is not an issue of ecumenism which is at stake, but the determination of which ecumenical relationship a voluntary body will maintain. Voluntarism as a critique. One of the most significant functions of voluntarism is the capability to assess weaknesses and inadequacies in existing institutions and provide an alternative. In the 17th century English context, this was labeled dissent, which is actually a term that describes the critique itself rather than a more holistic definition of a reaction plus an alternative. For much of the 17th century, dissenting groups were uncertain of their status, largely due to the hostile political environment in England until toleration. The growth of sectarianism in the 18th century as the logical conclusion of English dissent is a model for understanding long-term voluntarism in transatlantic culture. Not all dissent has a voluntary quality about it. The confessional churches of the Reformation, for instance, provided a variegated critique of Roman Catholicism. Yet Catholicism was frequently replaced with a parish structure or episcopacy and distinct para-congregational lines of authority and accountability. The Collegia Pietatis, mentioned 2 evenings ago, in the Pietist tradition, critiqued a lethargic religious circumstance by a call for renewal within the existing structures and lines of authority. Methodism, mentioned last evening in the 18th century, likewise was at first a voluntary renewal tradition within the Church of England. Then it grew into a highly authoritarian connectional church structure remarkably akin to its parent body. More purely voluntary critique, in contrast, survives outside structures and rests on the free support of those committed to its principles. It can remain para-church or become denominational in character. Congregationalists, Baptists, the Society of Friends, and the voluntary associations we have seen this week all imitate this pattern more typically than the older territorial church bodies, Christian bodies. The Free Will Baptist saga within the Baptist family in North America is a classic example of the power of a voluntary theological critique. At the conclusion of the 18th century North American colonial experience, Calvinistic theology reigned supreme among regular Baptist churches in the Northeast. Practically, what this meant was that the visible church was composed of specific congregations who had ratified a covenant by believers' baptism, and the sacrament or ordinance of the Lord's Supper was restricted to baptized members. Little external evangelism occurred, largely because congregational families produced successive generations of new members. Church growth came from the wholesale conversion of congregations from separatism, and ministers made every good attempt to safeguard Reformed theology in sermons and pastoral care. In New England, the Old Northwest, and the British provinces after the American Revolution, this was dramatically modified by the Free Will Baptist movement. Benjamin Randall, its founder, was educated theologically by his own experience, which included a Congregationalist upbringing and a memorable conversion experience in the 1770s under the evangelist George Whitefield. Benjamin began to preach doctrines of free grace and free will and free communion, the ultimate essence of voluntarism, and stalwartly resisted the attacks of regular Baptists on his system. Randall's theology provided a welcome alternative to determinism and attracted large numbers of poor farmers and lower-class artisans in villages and small cities from Nova Scotia to Michigan. By the 1840s, the Free Will Baptists had developed their own mission projects. They were active in social concerns, and by the way, ordained the first women among Baptists, and their structural freedom allowed for a number of advances that we count now in the overall Baptist saga. They became a major voice in the revivals of the Second Great Awakening and the subsequent Charles Finney era of social reform. Remarkably, they were one of the few theologically Arminian sects in North America which did not adopt the holiness theology in the 1850s, when perfectionism split Quakers and many of the other groups' disciples that we have talked about. Regular Baptists, particularly on the frontier, also developed revivalistic, theologically tolerant styles. Gradually, by the late 19th century, the issue of closed communion faded among rural first and then urban churches in the Northeast, and little distinctive was left between the free will and regular branches. By the 1890s, free will leaders were discussing the possibility of union with their old adversaries, the regular Baptists, because overall, the regular Baptist theology and style was, to use one person's words, agreeably enough Arminian and evangelistic. In all other basic issues, both Baptist groups were defending the same essential principles. Following about a 15-year conversation, union came in both Canada and the United States in 1905 through 1911. To the credit of the visionary and irenic leadership on both sides, it remains the primary example of a positive reaction among Baptists to voluntary critique, and in part because the free will agenda was progressive enough to reflect changing social patterns to which 18th century Calvinism was resistant. A second example of how a voluntary religious association provided a powerful critique of a social problem can be found in the 18th and 19th century American Quaker anti-slavery effort. With Quakerism, there had always been a theological basis antagonistic to chattelry. All persons, they wrote, were equal in God's sight. Slavery was involuntary bondage. Nonviolence was taught in the New Testament, and the teaching of friends that Christians had a personal obligation to be industrious. Early on, when confronted with American slavery, Pennsylvania Friends in the Germantown meeting issued an appeal in 1688 to abolish the slave trade. An elite in the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting at first refused to consider the proposal, But that sent the whole issue into a cycle of voluntarism. The next step was taken in the 1750s when Quaker writer John Woolman penned his now famous tract, Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes. A reform movement ensued among many of the meetings in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which included discipline against any friends who bought or sold slaves. The catalyst, though, which moved anti-slavery efforts from debate in the regular channels of yearly and monthly meetings and trials over disciplinary matters to an active effort to bring about change in public policy was the establishment in 1775 of the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. The group has been identified as essentially a Philadelphia Quaker body, which was humanitarian in nature. But following the American Revolution, Quaker members strengthened the association with a broader membership, including even inviting Benjamin Franklin as an honorary Quaker and president. Known as the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, Friends vigorously sought assistance for freed slaves and changes in state laws. Ultimately, victory came in 1788 when the Pennsylvania legislature, under intense lobbying from Quakers, freed slaves living in Philadelphia and imposed fines for cooperation with the slave trade. In several instances where the society enticed Southerners slaves to freedom, politicians visiting the city, bringing their slaves with them, were also penalized. As one recent historian has said, it was the experience of Quakers in the Delaware Valley organizing to oppose slavery that set the tone for the white anti-slavery crusade in the United States and Canada from 1780 to 1850. Indeed, it may be argued that the voluntary structure of the Friends was the model for both anti-slavery societies at the state level and the international anti-slavery movement organized by the likes of William Wilberforce and William Lloyd Garrison, among many other religious leaders. Thus, a voluntary critique by a religious group had a powerful and long-lasting social policy impact. Voluntarism produces common services. An important function of voluntary religious organizations has been to experiment with new forms of service, not included in the usual life of organized religious structures. Examples of this function include missionary endeavor, relief, ministry to special groups or concerns like older persons, native peoples, etc., and publication projects. In many instances, these types of activity transcend confessional boundaries and draw from a variety of individuals and churches. The Bible Society movement is a prime example. It became obvious to early missionaries in the wake of William Carey that Christian thought and culture was most accurately expressed in the Bible and most easily communicated in the native languages. Translation of scriptures was often a byproduct of linguistic training for the missionaries themselves. The first European and North American missionaries all concentrated, and probably still do, on translation efforts in their initial years in Africa, India, and China. The principal problem for them came to be providing for copies and editions of what they produced, plus other literary tools needed for the work, such as dictionaries or commentaries. The denominational mission bodies which sent abroad the personnel were not sufficiently endowed to sponsor the publication work. The first Bibles printed for wide distribution in the English language were produced by the SPCK, which we met 2 days ago. The need of Welsh language scriptures led to pressure on this group, but the SPCK only partially met the demand. Through a series of fortuitous associations in 1802, Thomas Charles of Bala, Wales, Joseph Hughes, a Baptist minister at Battersea, and Joseph Hardcastle, a merchant at London Bridge, covenanted with several friends in the Religious Tract Society to to form, quote, a society for promoting more extensive circulation of the Holy Scriptures at home and abroad. The historian of that organization suggested that at first there was doubt and deep denominational prejudice, but the leaders pressed ahead with their idea. In typical British voluntary fashion, a meeting of interested persons was called at the London Tavern in February 1804, and the society, with too long a title, became simply the British and Foreign Bible Society, with 300 persons involved from Lutherans, Anglicans, Quakers, and a host of other denominations. 3 secretaries were chosen to represent broadly the constituency, and the society had a single object, and I quote, to encourage the wider circulation of the Holy Scriptures without note or comment. An executive committee of churchmen and nonconformists in equal numbers was chosen, and the first years of the society were marked by an unusual catholicity of spirit. Unlike the United States voluntary board tradition, the committee actually engaged in administrative work, which at sometimes proved cumbersome. Indeed, its usefulness to several other bodies involved in overseas work, given its usefulness to several other bodies involved in overseas work, the British and Foreign Bible Society soon claimed working alliances with the London Missionary Society, the Church Missionary Society, and the Sunday School Union, targeting India, China, the South Seas, Canada, and Europe. Within a dozen years, the Society produced 1.6 million copies of the Scriptures. Among the most important outgrowths of the formation of the British and Foreign Bible Society was undoubtedly its influence upon the foundation of other similar voluntary bodies, and indeed, as one historian has said, the transformation of religious culture in Victorian Britain. Bible societies grew up in Edinburgh, in various parts of Europe, and especially for seamen during the Napoleonic Wars. Many of these were auxiliaries to the parent body, raising funds and specifying projects of interest to a local chapter which could be included in the larger work. In 1812, for example, the Southwark Auxiliary employed 650 voluntary agents in its section of the City of London. Even more importantly, as Ford Brown believes in his book Fathers of the Victorians, the Bible Society created a serious moral and religious public, which opened the door for a widespread, multi-class Victorian benevolence. It was the model for many other efforts. The Bible Society idea caught on in the United States as well. Missionaries for the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions noted its success and usefulness in the British context, and of course desired an American counterpart. Hostilities during the Napoleonic Wars between British interests and the United States suggested that American voluntarism would mature on its own. In 1816, to no one's surprise, an American Bible Society was formed in New York City from among the major denominational groups and state Bible organizations to serve the needs of the American missionary communities and the overseas bodies to whom they ministered. Under leaders like Archibald Maclay, a Scottish immigrant to the United States, and Elias Boudinot, the American counterpart to the British Bible Society movement, sponsored translations for Native Americans and the Burmese people. Primary in support were Baptists. For several decades, cooperation for the American Society was congenial and multi-denominational. However, Baptists were also to provide some interesting pages of history. A group of clergy led by Spencer Cone and Charles Summers desired that the translation sponsored by the American Bible Society should reflect the literal reading of the New Testament Greek word for baptizo. Thus, baptize should be rendered, you got it, immerse. Obviously helpful to the Baptist position, this became a sore point for other denominations who did not practice immersion. Ultimately, the Baptists were unhappy with the Bible Society's board decision, and yes, they formed a new voluntary organization called the American and Foreign Bible Society in 1837. This short-lived body divided again, and a successor group, entirely Northern Baptist, called the American Bible Union, sponsored an edition of the Bible with the Baptist translations in 1866. It went through one edition. Ultimately, the Baptists tired of their extreme voluntarism and went back to the mainstream American Bible Society with a bankrupt American Bible Union. Most of the copies are still in Rochester, New York. With all of the internal dissensions, the Bible Society managed, though, to produce 1.9 million scripture portions in its first 20 years of work. Its receipts in the United States averaged $60,000 annually for the same period. In Canada, the Bible Society movement has taken a bit different course. The first foreign translation made for the British and Foreign Bible Society was in fact for the Mohawk Nation in Upper Canada, and subsequently English Bibles were distributed here in Nova Scotia as early as 1807. A branch society was formed in Nova Scotia that year, from which several auxiliaries to the British and Foreign Society in Canada were connected. Eventually, in 1904, the centenary year of the British Society, a Canadian Bible Society was formed, which continued to relate its work to the British body. True to form, the charter for the organization spoke of its identity, and still does, as a voluntary society, by which it meant that the work was funded by voluntary gifts and operated by a voluntary board of directors. Eventually, the Canadian Bible Society sought an independent status from the British parent until it joined forces in the 1940s with the United Bible Societies, an international federation of related voluntary groups. In its first decade of independent work, the Canadian Bible Society furnished over 50 million pieces of scripture in many different tongues. As of 1989, and this is a curiosity for a voluntary organization, the Canadian Bible Society had evolved into a not-for-profit corporation with an administrative staff of 81, an annual budget expenditure of over $12 million, and an endowment of over $20 million. Through the establishment of its effective alliances with other major religious structures, the Bible Society has itself become a part of the dominant religious culture in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. By its very nature, the service role of a voluntary society requires a singular purpose which is perceived by all to be necessary, and yet at the same time by none to be a mission priority of its own. These examples of voluntarism require broad bases of support from denominations and individuals, plus alliances with cognate organizations to deliver their services. Common service groups also require changing leadership patterns to reflect the variety of constituencies attracted to the voluntary association. Finally, the functions, renewal, critique, cooperation, service, which voluntary associations perform are essential to the life of the church. Some remind stale leadership of the need for revitalization in specific areas or generally. Others offer painful but necessary criticism of the church, which often can save the church from misdirected or lethargic mission. Still others reverse the cycle of dissent and separatism so characteristic of Protestantism and help us to discover ways and means of closer cooperation for common achievement. Finally, voluntarism can emerge as a means to accomplish a goal outside the natural boundaries of church mission and for which there are no available resources. In this regard, structured Christendom then broadens its involvement and new persons are added to its faith and life. Voluntarism, no matter how beneficial as illustrated here, can be, though, a threat to the life of institutional churches. It can represent dissent, interruption in the planning process of church organization, and competitive leadership, not to speak of unhappy Christian believers. The church, in what has come to be called the parachurch, may be seen as mutually exclusive, when in fact the parachurch represents the call for change and revitalization for the whole church. When engaged in dialogue, the voluntarist impulse becomes a vital tool for the church. To be sure, there is always a tendency for the voluntary cycle to continue, though unabated, and create continuing upheaval and instability. Such uncontrolled voluntarism is checked by a continual evaluation of effectiveness and relevance in the church, and a guarantee of democratic process which allows for the expression of dissent among Christians. Only as the nascent forces of voluntarism are allowed expression within the church and religious structures will they be positive forces of renewal and revitalization. The cycle of voluntarism is thus complete. In the first stage, religious organizations are called into being by theological, personal, social, and political factors. Gradually, these structures and organizations achieve a permanent existence of their own, and maintenance becomes a primary function. As this becomes more difficult in a voluntaristic culture, these organizations assume a mainstream status, which is frequently self-protective and lacking in creativity and openness to change. In response, a new set of voluntarist forces set in, calling for appropriate modification, renewal, critique, or change, greater cooperation, or service. In the final stage of the voluntarist cycle, the religious structures are modified and/or the voluntary vehicles assume a role as part of the mainstream itself. Allow me to conclude these lectures on voluntarism with the sage words of the writer of Ecclesiastes, something of a voluntarist, I suspect, himself. For everything there is an appointed season, and there is a proper time for every project under heaven, a time to plant and a time to root up what is planted, a time to retain and a time to discard, a time to rend and a time to sow. Thank you.